A blood-soaked German shepherd staggered onto the porch of a lonely roadside cottage, scratching weakly at the door before collapsing into the rain. 76-year-old Sarah Johnson, a widow who had spent years helping strangers while the world forgot her, looked into the dog's desperate eyes and knew someone was dying in the forest. She had no idea that one act of compassion would uncover a deadly military conspiracy and change her life forever. Stay with us until the very end, and if stories of faith, courage, and extraordinary dogs inspire you, don't forget to subscribe. Cold rain swept across the pine forests of southern Georgia, blurring the empty highway into a ribbon of darkness. The storm had arrived without warning, dragging thick clouds over the endless woods and swallowing the last traces of daylight. Water hammered against the windshield of a dark government-issued SUV as its headlights carved two pale tunnels through the rain. Beyond the pavement, miles of dense pine trees stretched in every direction, broken only by abandoned logging roads and steep ravines that disappeared into blackness. There were no houses, no passing traffic, no comforting signs of civilization, only the sound of rain and the feeling that the forest itself was watching. Behind the steering wheel sat a man whose face carried the unmistakable marks of a life spent serving others at great personal cost. At 38 years old, he possessed the broad shoulders and powerful build that years of military training never truly left behind. His dark brown hair was cut close in the disciplined style he had worn since his Navy days, while a neatly trimmed beard softened a jawline carved by countless difficult decisions. Deep blue eyes remained calm, even as exhaustion lingered beneath them. Thin white scars disappeared beneath the collar of his jacket, silent reminders of missions that had never been spoken about outside classified rooms. His name was Ethan Walker. People who met Ethan for the first time often mistook his quiet nature for emotional distance. In truth, it was something very different. Years earlier, during one disastrous overseas operation, he had watched good men die because someone far above his pay grade had chosen politics over truth. Ever since that day, Ethan had learned that speaking only when necessary often revealed more than endless conversation ever could. Those who earned his trust discovered a man of unwavering loyalty, remarkable patience, and a stubborn refusal to abandon anyone placed under his protection. Tonight, that promise weighed heavier than ever. The passenger beside him barely looked 30. His clothes were plain, chosen specifically to avoid attracting attention, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled every few seconds despite his repeated attempts to hide the fear by gripping his seatbelt. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept properly in days. His name was Daniel Brooks. Daniel had never carried a weapon, never worn a military uniform, and never imagined becoming the target of professional killers. A civilian systems analyst contracted to review procurement records for a naval logistics program. He had stumbled onto something he should never have seen. What began as irregular accounting entries slowly unfolded into evidence of equipment theft, falsified mission reports, and financial corruption reaching far higher than anyone expected. Then came the files that terrified him. Most records suggesting an entire classified operation had ended with loyal servicemen being deliberately eliminated rather than brought home. He had become more than a whistleblower. He had become a living witness. Neither man spoke for several miles. The silence inside the vehicle felt less uncomfortable than necessary. Both understood that every unnecessary word wasted precious concentration. Ethan kept one hand resting lightly against the steering wheel, while the other occasionally checked the rearview mirror. Not once did his expression betray panic, yet every instinct sharpened with each passing mile. Something wasn't right. The road behind them remained empty. Too empty. Military experience had taught Ethan that genuine safety rarely announced itself. More often, danger revealed itself through the absence of ordinary life. No trucks. No late-night travelers. No wildlife crossing the road. Even the forest seemed unnaturally still. A soft whine rose from the back seat. Ethan glanced into the mirror again, but this time he wasn't checking the road. A pair of intelligent amber eyes met his. The German shepherd slowly lifted his head despite obvious discomfort. At nearly 8 years old, Rex represented everything military working dogs were meant to become. His black and tan coat had begun showing faint silver around the muzzle, signs of experience rather than weakness. Powerful shoulders and disciplined posture reflected years of specialized canine training. His ears stood alert despite fatigue, while countless tiny scars hidden beneath his fur hinted at dangers he had survived alongside human teammates. Unlike ordinary pets, Rex had never judged people by uniforms, wealth, or words. He judged them by heartbeat, by scent, by intention. After completing multiple deployments together, Ethan no longer viewed Rex as equipment or even simply as a dog. They had shared explosions, freezing nights, impossible rescues, and moments where each had trusted the other more completely than either trusted themselves. Now, Rex stared toward the rear window, not barking, not growling, just watching. That worried Ethan more than either reaction would have. "What is it, partner?" he asked quietly. The dog didn't move. His nose twitched once, then again. His entire body stiffened. Daniel noticed it too. Does he hear something? He smells something. Daniel swallowed. Should we stop? Ethan answered without hesitation. No. His voice remained calm, but inside, old instincts had already begun assembling possibilities. Professional surveillance, drone support, roadblock ahead, coordinated ambush. Every scenario carried one common conclusion. Someone knew exactly where they were. He pressed a hidden button beneath the dashboard. No response. He tried again. Nothing. The encrypted communication system had gone dead. Not damaged. Jammed. A cold certainty settled into Ethan's mind. They hadn't simply been discovered. Someone had prepared this road long before they arrived. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the roof, until conversation became little more than muffled sound. Then, the first headlights appeared. Not behind them, ahead. Far ahead. Two beams emerged around a distant bend before stopping sideways across the narrow highway. Daniel leaned forward. Why are they blocking the road? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His breathing slowed. Every muscle relaxed instead of tightening, the way years of combat had conditioned him before violence. Daniel. Yeah? When I tell you to move. Daniel turned toward him. Don't hesitate. The younger man's face turned pale. Ethan. What's happening? Before he could answer, another pair of headlights exploded from the darkness behind them. Fast. Much too fast. The vehicle closed the distance with frightening precision before settling directly behind the SUV. No flashing lights. No horn. Just relentless acceleration. Rex rose onto all fours. A deep growl rolled through his chest. Not loud, not frantic. The sound carried the unmistakable warning of an experienced military dog recognizing imminent violence. Ethan looked once toward the forest, lining both sides of the highway. Steep slopes, heavy trees, limited visibility. Exactly the kind of terrain professionals preferred. His greatest fear wasn't for himself. It was for the terrified civilian sitting beside him. He had promised Daniel that if they reached the federal safe house before dawn, everything would finally be over. Now Ethan wondered whether that promise had already become impossible to keep. Without warning, brilliant white lights erupted from both sides of the road, illuminating the rain-soaked highway like daylight. The trap had closed. For the briefest fraction of a second, everything stood perfectly still. The blinding floodlights erased every shadow, turning the rain into silver sheets that danced across the windshield. Ethan's pupils narrowed instantly. The lights were not meant to help anyone see. They were designed to steal vision, to create hesitation, to force instinctive mistakes. Whoever had arranged this trap understood tactical engagements. Gunfire shattered the silence. The first burst tore through the front grille, sending sparks flying across the hood. Before the shattered glass could finish falling inward, Ethan jerked the steering wheel hard to the right. The SUV slammed off the pavement, crashing through a line of young pine trees as branches exploded against the windows. Daniel cried out, instinctively throwing both arms over his head. "Keep your head down," Ethan shouted. Bullets ripped through the rear hatch. Metal screamed. The back window disappeared in a storm of glass. Rex lost his footing as the vehicle bounced violently over exposed roots, but he immediately regained his balance, planting himself between Daniel and the shattered rear opening as though his own body were a shield. Ethan's heartbeat remained remarkably steady. Fear was there, only a fool felt none, but years of combat had taught him that panic stole seconds, and seconds cost lives. Every calculation raced through his mind with brutal efficiency. They had at least 2 vehicles. Judging from the volume and direction of fire, likely 6 or more attackers. The communication system had been jammed before the ambush began. This was not an opportunistic attack. Someone with resources wanted Daniel dead. The SUV struck a hidden boulder with tremendous force. The entire vehicle lurched sideways before rolling down a muddy embankment. Steel twisted. Airbags exploded open. The violent impact knocked the breath from Ethan's lungs as the world became a blur of crushing metal and deafening noise. The vehicle finally came to rest against a cluster of thick oak trees halfway down a ravine. Steam hissed from beneath the crushed hood. For several seconds, nobody moved. Rain poured through the broken windows. Somewhere above them, engines stopped. Ethan forced himself to inhale, despite the burning pain spreading across his ribs. Warm blood trickled beneath his shirt. His left shoulder screamed in protest when he reached for the seatbelt release. Daniel was still conscious. "Ethan," he whispered weakly. "I'm here." I can't hear very well." "That's normal." Ethan cut through the deployed airbag with a rescue knife attached inside the console. His movements remained controlled despite growing dizziness. He turned toward Daniel, quickly checking for catastrophic injuries. A cut across the forehead. Bruised chest. Possible concussion. Alive. That was enough. Then Rex pushed between them. The German Shepherd limped heavily, his breathing ragged. Blood stained the fur along one shoulder where shattered glass and twisted metal had ripped through the muscle. Another deep wound crossed one rear leg, yet he ignored both injuries completely. His nose searched Ethan's face before nudging his chest with urgent determination. "I'm all right, buddy," Ethan lied. Rex answered with a quiet whine. He knew better. Smoke drifted from beneath the dashboard. Then Ethan smelled gasoline. Not leaking. Pouring. His eyes lifted immediately. The fuel line. He looked toward the crushed front end. "We have maybe 1 minute." He forced Daniel's door open with both feet. It barely moved. Another desperate shove widened the gap enough for the younger man to crawl outside. "Listen to me carefully," Ethan said, gripping Daniel's jacket. Daniel's frightened eyes locked onto his. "You follow the creek. What about you?" "You keep moving." "I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice." Daniel shook his head repeatedly. "They'll kill you." "They'll kill both of us, if you stay." For the first time since the attack began, Ethan allowed emotion to surface. Not fear, responsibility. Every mission he had ever survived echoed inside his thoughts. Protect the civilian. Complete the objective. Accept the cost. His life had always been expendable compared to the people entrusted to him. Nothing about that had changed. He reached inside his jacket and removed a small waterproof GPS beacon no larger than a pack of gum. This still works, independently. Daniel accepted it with trembling fingers. "When you reach cell service, activate it." "And you?" "I'll make sure they follow me." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "You mean distract them?" Ethan offered the faintest smile. "I mean, survive long enough for you to disappear." Heavy footsteps echoed somewhere above the ravine. Voices. Calm. Professional. They went over the edge. Spread out. Find the witness. The attackers weren't shouting. That frightened Ethan more than rage ever could. Disciplined men remained disciplined because they expected success. He looked at Rex. The dog stood beside him despite blood dripping steadily onto the soaked ground. "You stay with him." Rex didn't move. "You hear me?" Still nothing. Ethan knelt, despite the pain, and rested one hand against the dog's wet neck. The familiar warmth beneath the soaked fur stirred memories that flashed through his mind in an instant. Training fields under the summer sun, successful rescues, quiet evenings after impossible missions, the countless times this dog had trusted him without hesitation. "I need you to protect him now." Rex's ears lowered. His amber eyes never left Ethan's face. For one impossible second, Ethan wondered if the dog truly understood every word. Then another burst of gunfire struck the wrecked SUV. Flames erupted beneath the engine compartment. "There! They're still alive!" Flashlights swept through the trees. Ethan grabbed a fallen branch and hurled it deep into the forest. The crashing sound immediately pulled several beams away from Daniel's position. "Move," Ethan whispered. Daniel hesitated only one heartbeat before disappearing into the darkness beside the creek. Good. One life still had a chance. Ethan deliberately climbed higher up the slope, making himself visible between the trees. 2 more rounds slammed into the trunk, inches from his shoulder. "They're after me now," he muttered. Exactly as planned, he sprinted across the rain-soaked hillside despite the burning agony spreading through his side. Another shot struck him. A violent impact exploded through his lower back. His legs nearly gave way. He kept running. Pain became meaningless. Only distance mattered. Behind him, voices shifted direction. "I've got movement." "Leave. The other one. Take him down!" The trap had changed targets. Ethan allowed himself one final glance toward the creek. Daniel was gone. Thank God. A second bullet struck. This one tore across his left side. His strength faltered. The muddy ground vanished beneath his boots as the hillside collapsed into open darkness. He felt himself falling. Branches whipped across his face. Sharp rocks slammed into his body. Then everything became silence. Far above, the burning SUV illuminated the ravine with an eerie orange glow. Rex reached the edge only moments later. The German Shepherd ignored the men, shouting behind him. Ignoring every instinct of self-preservation, he scrambled down the unstable slope, sliding through mud and broken branches until he found Ethan, lying twisted among shattered stones at the bottom of the ravine. The former Navy SEAL was barely conscious. Blood spread steadily beneath him, carried away by the rain. Rex barked once. No answer. He nudged Ethan's shoulder. Nothing. He grasped the fabric of Ethan's jacket with his teeth and pulled with every ounce of strength left in his wounded body. The man barely moved. Again. 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 The dog refused to stop. Each attempt reopened the deep wounds across his own shoulder and hind leg. Blood mixed with rainwater until the ground beneath them turned dark crimson. His muscles trembled from exhaustion, yet he continued dragging, straining, refusing to abandon the only person who had never abandoned him. Minutes passed. The effort accomplished almost nothing. Above the ravine, distant flashlights continued searching through the storm. Rex froze, his ears lifted. Far away, carried faintly through the relentless rain, another scent drifted on the wind. Smoke from an old fireplace. Fresh bread. Soap. And something else. Home. The German Shepherd slowly raised his head. Beyond the trees, almost hidden by the rain, a single warm yellow light glowed through the darkness. The small yellow light belonged to the only house standing for miles along that lonely stretch of highway. It was an aging wooden cottage resting beneath 2 enormous pecan trees whose branches had weathered more than half a century of Georgia storms. The white paint had long ago faded into soft shades of gray, and parts of the front porch leaned slightly from years of neglect. Wild roses climbed one side of the railing, while a weathered rocking chair sat near the front door, gently moving beneath the force of the wind, as though someone had only recently stood from it. The house was modest in every imaginable way, yet the warm light glowing through its front window carried something wealth could never purchase. It felt like hope. Inside lived Sarah Johnson. At 76 years old, Sarah had grown thinner than she had been in her younger years. Her narrow shoulders, slightly curved from decades of hard work, rather than age alone. She stood just over 5'4", with silver-gray hair pulled neatly into a loose bun at the back of her head. Deep brown skin, softened by countless summers beneath the Georgia sun, carried delicate wrinkles that reflected kindness far more than hardship. Her gentle eyes remained remarkably clear, warm chestnut in color, always seeming to notice pain in others long before anyone spoke of it. People who knew Sarah often remarked that she smiled with her entire face. People who judged her from a distance rarely noticed the smile at all. Most of the younger generation driving past her home assumed she was simply another poor widow surviving on a small pension. Few realized that the little cottage had once echoed with laughter, family dinners, neighborhood gatherings, and Christmas songs. Even fewer remembered the man who had built much of it with his own hands. Her husband, Michael Johnson, had served as a firefighter in the county for nearly 40 years before losing his life during a warehouse rescue 15 years earlier. He had entered a burning building after everyone else believed it was empty. A frightened little girl had been trapped inside. He found her. He never came back out. The town mourned him for a few weeks. Then life continued. Sarah remained. Grief had changed her, though not in the way many expected. She never became bitter. She never learned to resent people who forgot her husband's sacrifice. Instead, loneliness quietly transformed into compassion. Having experienced the unbearable silence that followed losing the person she loved most, she found herself instinctively recognizing loneliness in others. Whether someone needed a warm meal, a ride to a doctor's appointment, or simply another human being willing to listen without judgment, Sarah somehow appeared before anyone asked. Kindness became the language through which she remembered Michael. On stormy evenings like this one, she often baked bread. The familiar routine calmed her whenever thunder awakened memories of the night firefighters had arrived at her own front door, carrying news that had shattered her world. A loaf cooled on the kitchen counter, while an old kettle whispered softly atop the stove. Classical music drifted quietly from a small radio, whose reception faded whenever rain became too heavy. The cottage smelled of fresh bread, cinnamon, and cedar wood, warmed by the crackling fireplace. Sarah folded a kitchen towel carefully before glancing toward the rain outside. So much rain, she murmured to herself. She always spoke aloud when alone. Silence had become too heavy after Michael died. Another flash of lightning illuminated the empty highway beyond her front yard. Nothing moved. She returned to washing a teacup. Then came the sound. Not loud, barely noticeable. 3 soft knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Sarah paused. No one visited after dark, especially during storms. Perhaps a loose branch, perhaps the wind. She waited. Again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, she knew. Someone or something stood outside. Without panic, Sarah reached for the flashlight, hanging beside the door. Michael had insisted years earlier that every house should have one within arm's reach. "You prepare before you need it," he used to say. She smiled faintly at the memory before unlocking the front door. Cold rain immediately swept across the porch. Her flashlight beam lowered instinctively. For one heartbeat, she could not understand what she was seeing. A German shepherd stood barely 3 feet away. No. Not simply stood. The dog struggled to remain standing. Rainwater streamed from his thick black and tan coat, but much of the dark color covering his fur wasn't rain at all. It was blood. Fresh blood. His powerful body shook uncontrollably from exhaustion. One rear leg barely supported his weight, while a deep wound across his shoulder had soaked nearly half his coat, crimson. Mud clung to his paws. His breathing came in shallow bursts, each inhale sounding painfully forced. Yet what struck Sarah most was not the injuries. It was his eyes. They held neither fear nor aggression, only desperate purpose. The dog looked directly at her, then slowly lifted one trembling paw. He tapped the wooden porch, once, almost politely. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes before she fully understood why. "Dear Lord," her voice barely escaped above a whisper. "You came looking for help." The German shepherd gave a weak whine. He did not step toward her. He did not beg for food. Instead, he turned his head toward the forest, then looked back at Sarah. Again, toward the woods. Back to her. Years earlier, Michael had occasionally brought retired search and rescue dogs home after difficult operations. Sarah had learned enough from those experiences to recognize disciplined working animals. This dog wasn't behaving randomly. He was communicating. Someone else needed help, badly. Sarah slowly crouched, despite the stiffness in her knees. "It's all right, sweetheart." The dog remained perfectly still. She extended one weathered hand. He sniffed gently. No growl, no hesitation, only another pleading look toward the darkness beyond the highway. Sarah's heart tightened. Whatever this animal had endured tonight, he had refused to stop until reaching her door. That kind of determination only came from extraordinary training or extraordinary love. She examined him as quickly as possible without causing additional pain. Military-style leather collar, heavy-duty stitching, signs of professional K, 9 equipment recently removed, numerous old scars beneath the fur. This was no family pet wandering after an accident. He belonged to someone who had almost certainly been injured too. Sarah looked toward the endless wall of trees. The rain continued, falling relentlessly. At her age, common sense argued she should call emergency services and remain inside. Another voice answered just as quickly. What if there wasn't enough time? She remembered Michael saying something many years before while polishing his firefighter helmet. The first few minutes decide whether someone lives long enough for help to matter. Those words had never left her. She looked back at the German Shepherd. "I don't know who you're trying to save." The dog held her gaze. "But I don't believe you came to the wrong house." Sarah disappeared briefly inside, returning moments later, wearing a thick waterproof coat over her sweater. She pulled on old rubber boots, grabbed a large first aid bag that had belonged to Michael, and reached for the truck keys hanging beside the kitchen calendar. The German Shepherd watched every movement, despite swaying from exhaustion. "Can you show me?" His ears lifted. For the first time since reaching the porch, the dog seemed to gather what little strength remained inside him. Without another sound, he turned toward the rain-covered highway and began limping into the darkness. Sarah locked the front door behind her. Then, carrying nothing except a flashlight, a medical bag, and faith that compassion was sometimes stronger than caution, she followed the wounded dog into the storm. The old pickup truck stopped where the narrow dirt trail disappeared into the forest. Sarah switched off the engine and listened. The rain had softened into a steady drizzle, but the woods seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the frogs that usually sang after a summer storm had fallen silent. The German Shepherd was already several yards ahead, limping heavily but never once looking uncertain. Every few steps he paused, glanced back to make sure Sarah was following, and continued deeper between the towering pines. "Slow down, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, struggling to keep pace over the slippery ground. The beam from her flashlight swept across broken branches, muddy tire marks, and patches of disturbed earth that looked far too recent to belong to wildlife. She noticed where bushes had been crushed under tremendous force, as though something heavy had tumbled through them only a short time before. Then she smelled smoke, not the comforting scent of a fireplace. Burned metal. Fuel. Something terrible had happened here. Rex suddenly let out a low, urgent whine and disappeared over the edge of a steep embankment. Sarah hurried after him as carefully as her aging knees allowed. Holding on to tree roots for balance, she climbed down into the ravine, her boots sliding through wet clay until her flashlight settled on the twisted remains of a dark SUV resting against several oak trees. Its front end was mangled beyond recognition. One side still smoldered faintly beneath the rain. For a brief moment, Sarah simply stood frozen. She had witnessed automobile accidents before. Michael had taken her along to community emergency training years ago, so spouses would know how to react before ambulances arrived. But this scene felt different. It carried the unmistakable silence left behind after violence. Then Rex barked. Not loudly, just once. Sarah turned her light toward him. The dog was lying beside a man whose body was partly sheltered beneath fallen branches. He was motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Relief flooded through her. He's breathing. She knelt beside him without hesitation. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had expected, perhaps not yet 40. Rain had washed streaks of mud across his face, but it could not hide the disciplined features of someone who had spent much of his life in uniform. His hands were rough with old calluses rather than office work. Faint scars crossed one forearm. Even unconscious, his expression carried remarkable composure, as though years of responsibility had become part of him. Sarah set down her medical bag and forced herself to slow her breathing. Panic never saved anyone, Michael used to remind every new volunteer. She heard his voice as clearly now as if he were kneeling beside her. She gently checked the man's breathing first. Steady. Weak, but steady. Next, she looked for injuries that demanded immediate attention. His clothing was soaked with rain and stained from the accident. She worked methodically, using clean bandages to control the bleeding she could see while carefully avoiding unnecessary movement. Every action had a purpose. Michael had repeated those lessons until they became instinct. Keep him warm. Keep him breathing. Don't waste time worrying about what you can't change. Rex never left the man's side. The faithful dog watched every movement Sarah made. His ears twitched whenever the unconscious man breathed a little deeper, and each time Sarah reached toward him, Rex quietly sniffed her hand before allowing her to continue. "You've done everything you could," Sarah whispered to the exhausted animal. Only then did she notice how serious the dog's own condition had become. His shoulder carried a deep laceration hidden beneath rain-soaked fur, and one hind leg trembled whenever he shifted his weight. Yet he ignored every wound. His entire attention remained fixed upon the man lying beside him. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You're worried about him more than yourself." The dog rested his head gently against the man's arm. That single gesture told her everything. Whoever this stranger was, he had earned the unwavering loyalty of a remarkable animal. Sarah looked toward the steep hillside leading back to the trail. There was no possibility of moving him alone. Not safely. She reached into her coat pocket and retrieved her old mobile phone. The signal appeared and disappeared between a single bar and nothing at all. Calling emergency services might take precious time, and explaining how to reach this isolated ravine during the storm would be nearly impossible. Another name came to mind: Walter Green. Walter lived less than a mile away on the opposite side of the highway. At 72, he was a retired mechanic whose broad frame had grown slower with age, but not weaker. His thick white beard and weathered face made him appear stern to strangers. Yet everyone who truly knew him understood he possessed one of the gentlest hearts in the county. Years earlier, after losing his only son in a construction accident, Walter had quietly become the kind of neighbor who appeared whenever someone needed a roof repaired, a tractor pulled from the mud, or simply another pair of hands without expecting payment. Sarah managed to reach him on the third attempt. "Walter? Sarah? Are you all right? I need your truck. And I need your help." He heard something in her voice that required no further explanation. "I'll be there." Less than 20 minutes later, headlights appeared through the trees. Walter climbed down the embankment, carrying heavy tow straps and a folding stretcher kept in his truck for farm accidents. He stopped when he saw the unconscious stranger. "Good Lord." "I know. You call the sheriff?" "Not yet." Walter looked at her for several seconds. In all the years they had been neighbors, Sarah had never asked him to ignore proper procedure. Tonight she did not have to ask. He simply nodded. Together they worked with extraordinary care. Walter's strength handled the lifting while Sarah constantly monitored the injured man's breathing, adjusting blankets beneath him whenever the rough terrain threatened to jar him unnecessarily. Rex refused to leave, limping beside the stretcher every step of the journey back toward the truck. The drive to Sarah's cottage felt much longer than it truly was. Walter parked beside the porch, and the two elderly neighbors transformed Sarah's modest living room into an improvised place of recovery. The old sofa was moved aside. A sturdy guest bed that had not been used in years was prepared beside the fireplace where warmth filled the room. Dry blankets replaced soaked clothing as respectfully as possible, while clean bandages and fresh water slowly replaced the smell of rain and smoke. Only after the stranger had been settled did Sarah finally kneel beside Rex, The proud German shepherd had remained standing through sheer determination alone. Now, convinced that his master was no longer lying alone in the forest, his body finally surrendered to exhaustion. He lowered himself onto the braided rug beside the bed. Within moments, despite the pain he must have felt, sleep claimed him completely. Sarah covered him gently with an old quilt that Michael had once used for rescued search dogs. Then she looked toward the unconscious man. The storm continued outside. Inside, for the first time since the terrible night had begun, the little cottage became a place where hope was quietly allowed to return. Morning arrived quietly over the Georgia countryside, carrying with it a pale gray light that filtered through rain-soaked pines and settled gently upon Sarah Johnson's little cottage. The violent storm had passed, leaving behind only dripping branches, damp earth, and the lingering stillness that often follows a difficult night. To anyone driving along the nearby highway, the weathered house appeared exactly as it had for years, small, humble, almost invisible. That ordinary appearance would soon become its greatest protection. Inside, warmth from the stone fireplace spread slowly through the living room. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with homemade bread, replacing the smell of smoke and wet clothing that had filled the house only hours earlier. Sarah had slept less than an hour. She had spent most of the night checking the stranger's breathing, changing cool cloths when fever threatened to rise, and tending to the faithful German shepherd who refused to rest until exhaustion finally overcame him. The dog stirred first. Rex lifted his head from the braided rug beside the bed, blinking several times, as if trying to remember where he was. The pain in his shoulder returned the moment he tried to stand, and he released a quiet breath through his nose before forcing himself upright anyway. He immediately looked toward the man lying in bed, still alive. Only then did he relax enough to inspect his surroundings. Sarah noticed him almost immediately. "Good morning, brave boy," she said softly. She approached slowly, carrying a shallow bowl of clean water. Rex watched every movement with alert eyes, but there was no hostility in his posture. Instead, there was caution born from years of disciplined training. He sniffed the water before drinking deeply, then accepted Sarah's gentle hand against the side of his neck. "You're safe here," she whispered. Whether he understood the words or simply recognized kindness in her voice, Sarah could not tell. What she did know was that the intelligent animal never allowed his attention to drift far from the unconscious man. Every few seconds, his ears turned toward the bed, listening for the familiar rhythm of breathing. The movement came almost an hour later. Ethan's fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Then, his eyes opened. For several seconds, he stared silently at the wooden ceiling overhead, struggling to understand why he was alive. His military instincts returned before memory did. He attempted to sit upright in one swift motion. Pain stopped him immediately. His chest tightened, his breathing shortened, and the room tilted slightly before he forced himself to remain still. "Easy," Sarah said calmly from across the room. "Your body has already had enough excitement for 1 week." Ethan turned toward the unfamiliar voice. The elderly woman standing near the fireplace looked nothing like the people he usually encountered during dangerous assignments. She wore a simple blue cardigan over a faded floral dress, her silver hair neatly arranged despite the long night she had endured. There was gentleness in her expression, but it rested upon remarkable composure rather than weakness. His eyes scanned the room automatically. Front door, windows, fireplace, kitchen. No visible threats. Then, he found Rex. The German shepherd limped across the room as quickly as his injuries allowed. Ethan reached out instinctively. The dog pressed his head beneath Ethan's hand, releasing the first contented sigh Sarah had heard since the previous evening. A quiet smile crossed Ethan's face. "You stubborn old soldier," he murmured. "I told you to stay with Daniel." Rex simply remained beside him. Sarah heard the unfamiliar name. Daniel. So, there had been another survivor. She did not interrupt. Years of listening to grieving families had taught her that frightened people revealed truth only when given room to breathe. "You found us?" Ethan finally asked. "No. Sarah answered gently. "He found me." She nodded toward Rex. Ethan looked at his partner again, his expression slowly changing from confusion to disbelief. "He walked." Sarah smiled faintly. "He came all the way to my front porch." For the first time since awakening, Ethan closed his eyes. He pictured the steep ravine, the burning vehicle, the distance through the forest. Every mile, the wounded dog must have crossed, while bleeding. An emotion far stronger than relief settled quietly inside him. Gratitude. He rested his forehead briefly against Rex's. "You saved me again." Sarah quietly returned to preparing breakfast, allowing the man a few private moments with the companion who had refused to abandon him. When she finally placed warm tea beside the bed, Ethan looked at her with sincere appreciation. "I don't know how to thank you." "You can start by drinking that while it's still hot." Despite the seriousness of everything surrounding them, the gentle humor eased some of the tension filling the room. After several minutes, Ethan managed to sit more comfortably against the headboard. "My name is Ethan Walker." "I know." He looked surprised. "You said it in your sleep." Sarah's answer was truthful, though incomplete. Throughout the night, Ethan had spoken only fragments, short warnings, names she didn't recognize, and repeated instructions for someone called Daniel to keep running. None of it sounded like dreams. It sounded like unfinished duty. "I'm Sarah Johnson. It's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish the circumstances were different." "So do I." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Finally, Ethan glanced toward the front window. "What day is it?" "Tuesday morning." His mind immediately began calculating. Daniel had nearly a full day's head start if everything had gone according to plan. No. Daniel had future. Daniel had future. Daniel had Seti Heiled. He refused to finish that thought. Sarah watched the change in his expression. "You have someone you're worried about." "Yes. You don't have to tell me who." Ethan appreciated that answer more than she realized. Most people demanded explanations. She offered patience instead. After breakfast, Sarah gathered fresh bandages for Rex. The dog remained perfectly cooperative until she reached beneath the leather collar around his neck. Her fingers paused. Something hard rested beneath the thick leather lining, not decorative, not part of an ordinary collar. Curious, she carefully loosened the edge without removing it completely. Hidden inside was a small piece of black metal, no larger than the tip of her thumb. One side had been cracked almost completely through, as though someone had deliberately struck it with great force before placing it back. Sarah frowned. "This doesn't belong here." Ethan's eyes immediately sharpened. "What is it?" She turned the collar slightly so he could see. "I almost missed it." Even from across the room, Ethan recognized the object instantly. A military tracking beacon. Or rather, what remained of one. Its outer casing had been deliberately broken, the antenna snapped cleanly away. Someone had disabled it. Very carefully. Ethan's pulse quickened. The damaged beacon explained why the attackers had eventually lost Rex after the ambush. More importantly, it proved something he had feared since the night before. They had expected the dog to carry a functioning tracker. Instead, someone, perhaps during the desperate escape through the ravine, had destroyed it. Sarah looked from the broken device to Ethan. "I have a feeling this little piece of metal matters." Ethan held it silently for several seconds. Then he looked toward the quiet window overlooking the empty road. "It matters more than I hoped." Outside, the highway remained peaceful. Inside the cottage, neither of them realized that the calm surrounding the house would not last much longer. The cottage remained quiet, but Ethan no longer heard the comforting crackle of the fireplace. His attention stayed fixed on the broken tracking beacon resting in the palm of his hand. Years of military service had taught him that damaged equipment often revealed more than functioning equipment. Whoever had organized the ambush had expected to follow the beacon until the mission was complete. The fact that it had been deliberately disabled meant someone, or perhaps simple chance during the crash, had interrupted that plan. Sarah noticed the distant look in his eyes. "You've seen something like this before." Ethan nodded slowly. Military working dogs assigned to sensitive operations sometimes carry encrypted tracking devices. They allow rescue teams to locate both the handler and the dog if communications fail. She looked again at the damaged beacon. So someone wanted to make sure it couldn't be used. Exactly. Sarah placed the collar gently back around Rex's neck. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still throughout the conversation, though his ears twitched whenever Ethan spoke. Even exhausted, he continued watching the room with disciplined awareness, as though protecting his partner remained his only purpose. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. I won't ask questions you aren't ready to answer. Ethan appreciated the restraint, yet he understood something equally important. If Sarah had saved his life, she deserved to know why danger had followed him into her peaceful world. He drew a careful breath before speaking. I wasn't transporting documents. I wasn't transporting documents. Sarah remained silent. I wasn't carrying evidence in a briefcase. Another pause followed. What I carried, he said quietly, was my own memory. She frowned slightly. I don't understand. Ethan looked toward the fire, watching orange flames rise and disappear. Several weeks ago, my team was assigned to provide security during what we believed was a classified military operation. Officially, we were told we were protecting a logistics inspection. His voice remained steady, but Sarah noticed how tightly his hands gripped the blanket. It wasn't an inspection. What was it? A cleanup. Sarah felt an uneasy chill despite the warmth filling the room. Ethan continued, choosing every word with care. We arrived, expecting to recover stolen military equipment. Instead, we found civilians, investigators, and members of our own government arguing over financial records tied to defense contracts. He lowered his eyes. Someone had been stealing enormous amounts of money for years, and they didn't want anyone discovering it. No, Sarah waited. There was an argument over whether witnesses should be evacuated. His jaw tightened. Someone higher up made another decision. He stopped speaking. Sarah did not press him. The silence itself explained enough. Finally, Ethan looked at her again. When the shooting started, it wasn't coming from the people we had been sent to stop. Sarah's expression slowly changed. It came from your own side, Ethan answered with a single nod. My teammates believed we were protecting innocent people. His voice became quieter. They died, believing the same thing. The room fell completely silent. Sarah understood grief. She recognized it because she had carried her own for 15 years. I've spent every day since then asking myself whether I could have changed anything. She met his eyes gently. That's a question every survivor asks. He looked surprised. My husband asked himself that question after every fire where someone didn't make it home. Sarah smiled sadly. He never blamed the flames. She looked toward an old framed photograph resting on the mantel. He blamed himself. Ethan followed her gaze. The photograph showed a broad-shouldered African-American firefighter wearing an old-fashioned turnout coat, smiling beside a younger Sarah during what looked like a community picnic. Michael? She nodded. He believed saving 99 people somehow wasn't enough if he lost one. Ethan studied the photograph. I think I would have liked him. I think so too. For several minutes, neither spoke. The conversation had shifted something inside both of them. Sarah no longer saw only an injured stranger. She saw a man carrying invisible wounds, far older than those beneath the bandages. Meanwhile, Ethan no longer saw only the woman who had rescued him. He saw someone who understood that surviving tragedy often created burdens no medicine could heal. Rex slowly rested his head across Ethan's boot. The familiar weight brought Ethan back to the present. There was one civilian who escaped. Sarah immediately thought of the name she had heard during the night. Daniel. Yes. He was the witness? He discovered financial records that exposed the corruption, but papers can disappear. Ethan looked directly at Sarah. People can be discredited. She nodded. But someone who actually stood there, who saw what happened. becomes much harder to silence. Sarah finished the sentence quietly. And you're that person. I am. She finally understood. The attackers had not simply wanted information. They wanted the last living witness removed forever. A pickup truck rumbled past outside. Both Ethan and Rex reacted instantly. The dog lifted his head. Ethan turned toward the front window. The truck continued down the highway without slowing. Only after its sound faded did either of them relax. Sarah noticed the reaction. You expected them. They're professionals. You think they'll come here? I hope not. His answer worried her more than certainty would have. Late that afternoon, Walter Green returned carrying fresh groceries and additional firewood. The retired mechanic filled the doorway with his large frame, rain jacket hanging loosely over denim overalls. His thick white beard remained damp from the morning mist, and grease stains that never seemed to leave his weathered hands hinted at a lifetime, repairing engines rather than sitting behind a desk. Beneath his rugged appearance lived a patient, dependable man whose instinct was always to help before asking questions. He stepped inside quietly. How's our patient? Still too stubborn to stay in bed, Sarah answered with a faint smile. Walter chuckled. Then he'll probably recover. Ethan thanked him for the previous night's help. Walter waved the gratitude aside. My father taught me something years ago. He placed another log beside the fireplace. If somebody knocks on your door needing help, you help first. Only then did he glance toward the window. His expression changed. You expecting visitors? Sarah looked up. No. Walter remained silent for several seconds. A black SUV has driven past this house 3 times since I turned off the county road. The room immediately became still. It never slowed enough to stop. Walter frowned, but it slowed enough to look. Ethan exchanged a brief glance with Rex. The German Shepherd was already standing, not barking, watching. Sarah walked slowly to the lace curtain and looked through the narrow opening. The road appeared empty again. Yet something deep inside her, the same quiet instinct that had convinced her to follow a wounded dog into the forest, told her Walter wasn't mistaken. Someone had begun paying attention to a little house that the entire town had forgotten. The black SUV never returned that evening, but its quiet appearance left a shadow inside Sarah's little cottage long after the road became empty again. As dusk settled over the Georgia countryside, the familiar comfort of the house felt different. The old wooden walls still creaked softly as they always had. The grandfather clock continued its patient rhythm in the corner. The fireplace cast its warm amber glow across the braided rug where Rex rested with his head raised, alert despite his injuries. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of home lingered a shared understanding that none of them spoke aloud. Somewhere beyond the trees, strangers were searching. Sarah carried a bowl of homemade chicken soup to the small dining table where Ethan now sat for the first time since the accident. His movements remained slow, each careful motion reminding him that recovery demanded patience, something he had rarely allowed himself throughout his military career. Years of service had taught him to ignore pain whenever others depended upon him. Now, he found himself relying upon the kindness of a woman who had owed him nothing. You should eat while it's warm, Sarah said gently. Ethan looked at the simple meal before him. He could not remember the last time someone had prepared food simply because they wanted him to recover. Military life had been filled with field rations, hurried meals between assignments, and countless nights where exhaustion replaced hunger. Even after leaving active duty, solitude had become so familiar that he rarely noticed it anymore. This reminds me of my grandmother, he admitted quietly. Sarah smiled. Then she must have known how to make proper soup. For the first time in several days, Ethan laughed. The sound surprised even him. Rex lifted his ears briefly before settling again, apparently satisfied that nothing dangerous had entered the room. Walter Green had remained for supper, insisting that Sarah should not spend another evening alone after everything that had happened. Although retired for nearly a decade, Walter still possessed the quiet habit of observing every detail around him. Years repairing heavy farm machinery had made him patient, practical, and slow to draw conclusions without evidence. He glanced through the front window once more before speaking. I drove past the highway twice on my way back from town. Ethan looked up. See anything? Walter nodded. The sheriff's deputies were clearing what's left of that wreck in the ravine. Sarah stopped stirring her tea. They found it already? This morning. Walter leaned back thoughtfully. But something bothered me. What was it? Ethan asked. There weren't many deputies. Ethan remained silent. There were more men wearing plain jackets than uniforms. His military instincts immediately recognized the significance. Not local investigators. Federal agencies, perhaps. Or people pretending to be investigators. Either possibility carried consequences. Sarah noticed Ethan's expression change again. You don't think that's normal? No. Why? He answered carefully. If what happened was simply a traffic accident, local authorities would handle it. Walter nodded slowly. And if it wasn't? Then whoever controls the investigation controls the story. Then, silence settled over the room once more. Sarah had spent enough years watching court cases after Michael's death to understand what Ethan meant. Facts alone rarely decided public truth. Whoever gathered evidence first often shaped everything that followed. She folded her hands around her teacup. Yesterday you told me they weren't hunting documents. I did. They were hunting you. Yes. Sarah studied him for several moments before asking the question that had quietly grown inside her mind all afternoon. If that's true. She hesitated. Why are you still alive? The question lingered between them. Ethan looked into the fireplace. I've asked myself that several times. Walter waited. Finally, Ethan spoke. When the attack began, I wasn't thinking about surviving. You were thinking about Daniel, Sarah answered. Exactly. He slowly nodded. My responsibility was getting him away. So why chase you instead? Ethan's brow furrowed. Because they believed I still had something. The evidence? I wasn't carrying any. Sarah looked puzzled. But there has to be something. There is. He looked directly at her. I just don't know whether it still exists. Walter leaned forward. What are we talking about? Ethan took several seconds before answering. During the operation. Close quote. He chose each word with care. I realized something was wrong before the shooting started. His memory returned with surprising clarity. Arguments, raised voices, orders that made no tactical sense. Faces filled with fear rather than confidence. I always carried a tactical body camera during high-risk assignments. Walter frowned. Like police officers wear? Similar. It records everything? When activated. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. You mean? Ethan nodded slowly. There is a chance. Only a chance. That it recorded what happened before the attack. Walter looked from Ethan to Sarah. And where is it now? Ethan closed his eyes, searching through fragmented memories buried beneath pain and exhaustion. He remembered running through heavy rain, helping Daniel escape. Falling, branches, darkness. Then another memory surfaced. Not complete. Only an image. Stone walls, an old wooden cross, broken stained glass windows. His eyes opened suddenly. The church. Sarah frowned. What church? I don't remember everything. He pressed one hand against his forehead. But I remember stopping there earlier. Walter looked confused. You stopped at a church while running from gunmen? No. Ethan shook his head. Before the ambush. Another memory emerged. Daniel, asking for water. An abandoned building. A place hidden from the highway. I checked the equipment there. His breathing grew slower as each fragment returned. I removed the camera. Righted. Sarah listened carefully. I thought the tracker in my vehicle might be compromised. So you hit it. I think I did. Walter crossed his arms. You think? I don't remember exactly where. Sarah remained remarkably calm despite the revelation. Years earlier, after Michael's death, she had learned that trauma often scattered memory into disconnected pieces. People did not always forget because they wished to. Sometimes the mind simply locked painful moments away until it felt safe enough to uncover them. She stood and quietly walked toward an old wooden cabinet near the fireplace. After searching one of the lower drawers, she returned carrying a faded photograph protected inside a thin plastic sleeve. "I've been wondering whether this might help." She handed it to Ethan. The photograph showed an old brick church standing alone among towering pine trees. Much of the roof had collapsed. Ivy covered portions of the stone walls, and the bell tower leaned slightly with age. Ethan stared at it. Recognition flickered across his face. "That's it." Sarah smiled softly. "I thought you might say that." Walter looked surprised. "You know this place?" Sarah nodded. "My husband volunteered there many years ago." She carefully took the photograph back. "The church was abandoned long before either of us moved here." She traced one finger gently along the faded image, when Michael helped repair part of the foundation almost 20 years ago. Her expression grew thoughtful. The workers discovered something none of them expected. Ethan looked up immediately. "What did they find?" Sarah met his eyes. "A network of old tunnels beneath the church." The room became perfectly still. Outside, evening shadows settled across the forest. Inside, all three of them realized that the forgotten church might hold far more than memories. Walter stared at Sarah for several long seconds before finally speaking. "Tunnels?" Sarah nodded, her fingers still resting on the faded photograph. The firelight reflected softly across its worn surface, making the abandoned church appear almost alive beneath the dancing glow. "They weren't ordinary cellars," she explained. "Michael told me the workers originally thought they had discovered an old storage basement, but after clearing away years of fallen stone, they found narrow passageways extending much farther beneath the hill." Walter leaned closer. "I've lived here almost 50 years, and never heard anyone mention that." "Most people didn't," Sarah smiled faintly. "The county closed the site after engineers declared the church unsafe. Over time, people stopped talking about it altogether." Ethan listened without interrupting. As Sarah described the forgotten tunnels, scattered fragments of memory continued surfacing inside his mind. He remembered parking beside cracked stone steps. He remembered Daniel nervously checking the empty road. Most vividly, he remembered making a decision born entirely from instinct. Always separate yourself from the evidence. That habit had been drilled into him through years of military operations. If one hiding place failed, another might survive. He closed his eyes. "I wasn't thinking clearly after everything we'd seen." Sarah waited patiently, but I knew we were being watched. His breathing slowed. I remember removing the camera from my tactical vest. Another image appeared, a broken wooden pew, dust floating through shafts of afternoon sunlight, cold stone beneath his knees. "I hid it somewhere nobody would notice during a quick search." Walter folded his arms. "If those tunnels exist, they could hide almost anything." "They could," Ethan agreed. Sarah carefully returned the photograph to its protective sleeve before placing it on the table. "There was something else Michael told me." Both men looked toward her. "The passages weren't built by the church." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "They were much older." She paused, searching for the exact words Michael had used years before. According to one of the historians who visited the site, parts of the underground structure had been reinforced during the Cold War. Nobody knew exactly which agency had done it. There were rumors the tunnels had once been designated as emergency shelters or communication routes if military installations nearby ever came under attack. Walter raised an eyebrow. "I always thought those were just local stories." "So did Michael," Sarah admitted, "until he walked through them himself. The room fell quiet again. Rex, who had been lying peacefully beside Ethan's chair, slowly lifted his head, his ears angled toward the photograph on the table, before turning toward Ethan. Although the German Shepherd could not understand every word, years of working beside his handler had taught him to recognize moments when important decisions were being made. Ethan reached down, gently rubbing the dog's neck. "If the camera is still there." He never finished the sentence. Sarah completed it for him. "Then it may hold the truth." He nodded. "Maybe." Walter studied Ethan's face carefully. "You don't sound certain." "I'm not." The former Navy SEAL looked toward the window where evening darkness had nearly swallowed the trees. "The camera may have been damaged. It may have been discovered. It may not have recorded anything useful." "Agree." He spoke without dramatics, simply listing possibilities the way years of operational planning had taught him. But if it survived, he looked back at Sarah. Then whoever ordered that attack never realized they failed. Sarah understood exactly why that mattered. For the first time since rescuing Ethan, she could see a path that led somewhere beyond survival. Up until now, they had merely been reacting, keeping a wounded man alive, protecting a loyal dog, wondering whether strangers might return. Now, there was purpose. Truth, not revenge. Truth. She stood and quietly carried the empty soup bowls into the kitchen. While washing them beneath warm water, her thoughts drifted toward Michael once again. He had never believed courage belonged only to soldiers or firefighters. Courage. He often told neighborhood children during community safety days, is doing the next right thing after fear has already arrived. Those words echoed inside her mind. She dried her hands and returned to the living room. "If we're going to that church," she said calmly, "we shouldn't wait very long." Walter looked surprised. "You've already decided?" Sarah smiled gently. "I decided the moment I followed a wounded dog into the woods." Walter could not help returning the smile. "I suppose you did." Ethan, however, looked troubled. "I can't ask either of you to come." "You didn't." "This has nothing to do with your family." Sarah interrupted softly. "It became my concern the moment someone nearly died outside my home." Walter nodded in agreement. "And mine, when I helped carry him inside." Ethan looked from one elderly neighbor to the other. Neither appeared frightened. Neither appeared reckless. Both simply believed helping another human being remained the correct choice, regardless of inconvenience. The realization humbled him. For years, he had served beside highly trained professionals willing to risk everything for strangers they would never meet again. Now he had found the very same courage inside two ordinary people whom history would probably never remember. Rex suddenly stood, not because of pain, because he had heard something. The German Shepherd limped toward the front door, remaining perfectly silent. Ethan immediately noticed the change. "What is it, boy?" Rex stared toward the darkness beyond the porch. Walter quietly switched off the living room lamp. The cottage became dim, except for the glow of the fireplace. All three adults instinctively moved away from the windows. A pair of headlights appeared on the distant highway. They traveled slowly. Much slower than normal traffic. The vehicle continued forward until reaching the section of road directly opposite Sarah's property. Then it stopped. No one spoke. The engine remained running. After nearly 30 seconds, the vehicle pulled away and disappeared into the darkness without turning into the driveway. Walter exhaled quietly. "That's the same black SUV." Sarah looked toward Ethan. "They're looking." He nodded. "Not for this house." She frowned slightly. "For me." Silence settled over the cottage once again. The comforting sense of safety that had filled the room only moments earlier had quietly vanished. Ethan understood something with absolute certainty. Every hour they remained hidden increased the likelihood that whoever was searching would eventually stop looking for an injured survivor and begin searching every isolated home near the ambush site. He looked once more at the faded photograph of the abandoned church. If the camera truly remained hidden beneath those forgotten tunnels, It might be the only piece of evidence capable of proving what had happened before the ambush. And if it was still there, they would have only one opportunity to retrieve it before someone else arrived first. The abandoned church stood beneath a sky of pale gray clouds, its weathered bell tower rising above the surrounding pines like a forgotten guardian that had outlived everyone who once prayed within its walls. Early morning mist drifted across the clearing as Sarah guided Walter's pickup truck along the narrow dirt road leading toward the old property. The forest seemed unusually quiet. Sunlight struggled through layers of moss-covered branches, leaving patches of gold scattered across cracked stone walls and broken stained glass windows. Time had slowly reclaimed the place, allowing vines to wrap around brickwork and tree roots to push through the old foundation. Sarah parked beneath a large oak tree, nearly 100 yards from the church. "We shouldn't leave the truck too close," Ethan said quietly. She nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." Although he remained weaker than usual, Ethan insisted on walking under his own strength. Every movement reminded him that his body had not fully recovered, yet he refused to let Sarah or Walter shoulder responsibilities that belonged to him. His injuries slowed him, but they did not diminish the discipline that had guided him throughout his military career. Rex limped beside him with determined patience. The deep wound on his shoulder had begun healing, though his gait still favored one hind leg. Even so, his alert amber eyes constantly searched the tree line. Every shifting branch, every unfamiliar scent carried by the breeze, received his careful attention. Sarah admired the remarkable animal more with each passing day. She had cared for working dogs before, but never one whose loyalty appeared so completely intertwined with another human life. Walter remained several steps behind, carrying a powerful flashlight, a coil of rope, and a small crowbar borrowed from his workshop. "I haven't crawled around abandoned buildings since I was 20, he muttered with a faint smile. Sarah laughed softly. "Then today will remind you you're not 20 anymore. It reminds me every morning." The gentle exchange briefly lightened the tension before all four reached the weathered entrance. The heavy wooden doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. One had collapsed entirely years earlier, leaving the sanctuary open to wind and rain. Inside, rows of broken pews rested beneath a ceiling, where sunlight poured through wide holes left by decades of neglect. Dust floated silently through the beams of light, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere, despite the building's decay. Ethan stopped, just inside the entrance. The familiar scent of damp stone immediately awakened another fragment of memory. He had stood here, not long before the ambush. His eyes slowly moved across the sanctuary, the cracked marble floor, the damaged altar, the narrow staircase, descending beneath the rear wall. His breathing slowed. "It's coming back." Sarah remained silent, allowing memory to unfold naturally. "I remember Daniel sitting over there." Ethan pointed toward a fallen pew. He was exhausted. He turned slightly toward the rear of the church. "I walked down those steps." Without another word, he led them toward the staircase. The air became noticeably cooler as they descended below ground. Moisture covered the old stone walls, while narrow passages stretched into darkness beyond the reach of natural light. Concrete reinforcements, added decades after the church had been built, interrupted portions of the original masonry. Walter shined his flashlight along one corridor. "These weren't built by the church." "No," Sarah answered. Michael said exactly the same thing. The tunnels felt surprisingly solid despite their age. Steel support beams reinforced several intersections, while faded emergency markings remained barely visible beneath layers of dust. Whatever government agency had once occupied the underground complex had abandoned it many years before, leaving only silence behind. Rex suddenly stopped walking. His nose lifted. He slowly turned toward a side corridor. Ethan noticed immediately. "What do you smell?" The German Shepherd remained perfectly still before taking several deliberate steps into the narrow passage. "He remembers something," Sarah whispered. Ethan followed. His own memories continued returning piece by piece. A metal cabinet, a collapsed section of ceiling, a small maintenance room. Then he saw it. There, He pointed toward a partially collapsed storage chamber where broken shelving lay scattered beneath fallen concrete. I hid it behind those shelves. Walter immediately began moving loose debris aside with the crowbar, while Ethan carefully searched between shattered boards. Minutes passed. Nothing. Sarah watched Ethan's expression slowly tighten with disappointment. It's possible someone found it. I know. He refused to stop searching. Rex suddenly pawed at a pile of loose bricks near the back wall. Once, twice. Then he looked directly at Ethan. The former Navy SEAL walked over and knelt despite the pain in his side. He carefully removed several broken bricks. Behind them rested a small waterproof pouch covered with dust. For several seconds, no one spoke. Ethan recognized it instantly. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the pouch free. It survived. Walter released a quiet breath. I'll be damned. Sarah smiled without saying a word. Ethan slowly unsealed the weatherproof container. Inside rested a compact, tactical body camera. The outer housing carried fresh scratches, but it appeared largely intact. His heart pounded. So far, so good. Walter leaned closer. What about the recording? We won't know until we check the memory. Carefully, Ethan opened the camera housing. The battery had swollen slightly from moisture. The screen remained completely dark. For one painful moment, he feared everything had been lost. Then he removed the tiny memory card. Unlike the damaged electronics surrounding it, the card itself appeared untouched. Sarah saw hope return to Ethan's face. That means something? It means the video may still exist. He held the tiny card between his fingers with almost reverent care. If it recorded what I remember. He never finished the sentence. Rex growled. The sound was low, controlled. Every person in the tunnel froze. The dog wasn't looking at Ethan. He was staring back toward the staircase leading to the church above. Walter slowly switched off his flashlight. Footsteps echoed faintly through the ancient tunnels. Not one person. Several. Calm. Measured. Moving carefully across the sanctuary floor overhead. Someone else had arrived at the abandoned church. The faint footsteps above grew louder, then stopped altogether. No one inside the tunnel dared to move. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself, as though every heartbeat echoed through the abandoned passageways. Ethan instinctively slipped the memory card into a small waterproof pocket sewn inside the lining of his jacket before closing the damaged camera housing. If they lost the camera, the recording might still survive. If they lost the memory card, everything would be over. Walter leaned closer and whispered, "Do they know we're here?" "I don't think they know exactly where," Ethan answered just as quietly. "But they know someone came." Sarah's eyes moved slowly around the narrow chamber. The underground passages suddenly felt much smaller than they had only minutes before. She remembered Michael describing the tunnels as a maze that confused even experienced workers. At the time, she had laughed, never imagining that one day those forgotten corridors might become the only path separating innocent people from those who wished them harm. Rex remained motionless near the entrance to the storage room. His ears shifted independently, tracking sounds too faint for the others to hear. He gave one quiet glance toward Ethan before stepping into the corridor without making a sound. "He wants us to move," Sarah whispered. Ethan nodded. "He hears something changing." The group carefully left the storage room and followed Rex deeper into the tunnel system. Their flashlights remained switched off, forcing them to rely on the dim, natural light filtering through occasional ventilation shafts. Moisture dripped steadily from the stone ceiling, and every few yards another branching passage disappeared into darkness. Behind them, a distant metallic sound echoed through the tunnels. Someone had opened an old iron door. Walter looked over his shoulder. "They've come underground." Ethan listened carefully. "They're spreading out." Rather than hurrying, he deliberately slowed his pace. Years of experience had taught him that panic often created more noise than movement itself. Every step was placed carefully, avoiding loose stones and broken concrete. Sarah copied his movements surprisingly well, despite her age, while Walter quietly steadied her whenever the uneven floor became difficult. As they rounded another corner, Sarah noticed faded arrows painted on the wall decades earlier. "I remember these," she whispered. "Michael said they marked emergency exits." Ethan studied the markings. One of them should lead back toward the forest. Before anyone could continue, Rex suddenly stopped again. This time, he looked down another corridor running in the opposite direction. His body lowered slightly. Not from fear, from decision. Ethan immediately understood. "They're coming from ahead." Walter frowned. "Then we're trapped." No. Ethan examined the old map, painted directly onto the concrete wall. Most of the lettering had disappeared with age, but enough remained to understand the basic layout. These tunnels intersect farther north. Sarah followed his finger across the faded lines. So there are two routes. There were. He looked toward a section marked with an old maintenance symbol. If that passage hasn't collapsed. Without another word, they changed direction. The new corridor narrowed considerably, forcing them to walk single file. Tree roots had broken through parts of the ceiling over the years, twisting between the stone blocks like living ropes. Water pooled beneath their feet, reflecting the weak light filtering through narrow cracks overhead. Sarah could hear her own breathing becoming heavier, yet she refused to complain. She had chosen to help Ethan knowing the path ahead would not be easy. What surprised her most was not the danger surrounding them, but the calm she felt walking beside him. And Rex, courage, she realized, rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it simply meant taking one more step after deciding not to turn back. Far behind them, voices echoed faintly through the maze. The words themselves were impossible to distinguish, but their steady rhythm told Ethan the search was becoming more organized. "They're checking every branch," he murmured. Walter looked around. "Then they'll eventually find this one. Only if we stay here." Another 100 yards brought them to a partially collapsed junction. Massive chunks of concrete blocked the main tunnel, leaving only a narrow opening along one side, where years of erosion had created a crawl space, barely large enough for a person. Walter examined it. "I can squeeze through." "So can I," Sarah said. Ethan studied the opening before nodding. "It's our best chance." Walter went first, carefully pulling himself through the narrow gap before reaching back to help Sarah. Though the space was uncomfortable, she managed to pass safely. Ethan followed more slowly because of his injuries, while Rex slipped through effortlessly despite favoring one hind leg. The tunnel beyond widened into a long passage supported by thick concrete columns. At the far end, pale daylight shimmered through a rusted steel grate that had fallen partly away from its frame. Sarah smiled with relief. An exit. Fresh air drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Walter climbed out first, helping Sarah onto the forest floor. Ethan emerged moments later, taking one last look toward the darkness behind them. The tunnels had protected them. For now. They moved carefully through the trees, following an overgrown footpath that curved around the hill until the abandoned church disappeared behind dense woodland. Only when they reached Walter's pickup hidden beneath the large oak did everyone finally allow themselves to breathe more freely. Ethan removed the tiny memory card once more. It seemed impossibly small for something capable of changing so many lives. Sarah looked toward him. "We should leave." He nodded. "Immediately." As Walter started the truck, none of them noticed the faint trail of fresh footprints, leading away from another hidden tunnel entrance on the opposite side of the hill. Someone else had already discovered that the old church was no longer empty. And before the morning was over, the quiet little cottage that had sheltered them would become the next place their unseen pursuers intended to search. The first light of dawn spread quietly across the blackened remains of Sarah Johnson's little home, revealing what the darkness had hidden only hours before. Charred beams leaned against one another like exhausted survivors, while thin ribbons of smoke continued to drift into the cool Georgia morning. The wild roses that had once climbed the porch railing had withered beneath the heat, and the old rocking chair Michael Johnson had built decades earlier now lay broken beneath a collapsed section of roof. Sarah stood silently at the edge of the property with her hands folded in front of her. At 76, she looked smaller against the empty landscape than she ever had inside the little house that had sheltered so many lonely souls over the years. Her silver-gray hair, tied carefully into its familiar bun despite the sleepless night, reflected the pale morning sun. Soot marked the sleeves of her cardigan, yet her posture remained straight. Years of hardship had carved quiet strength into every line of her face. She had lost her husband, buried lifelong dreams, endured poverty, and watched neighbors gradually forget both her name and Michael's sacrifice. None of those losses had taught her bitterness. Instead, they had given her a remarkable ability to separate possessions from purpose. Ethan watched her from several yards away. He had expected tears. He had expected anger. He had prepared himself to accept either one without argument. Instead, Sarah simply gazed at the ruins with a calm expression that unsettled him far more than grief would have. Walter Green stood nearby, removing his worn work gloves as volunteers from a neighboring farm quietly stacked salvaged lumber into neat piles. No one spoke very much. Rural communities often understood that silence could express respect better than sympathy repeated too many times. Rex remained beside Ethan, though the German shepherd's eyes rarely left Sarah. The faithful dog sensed changes in people long before words revealed them. He walked toward the elderly woman, gently resting his head against the back of her hand. Sarah smiled and stroked the fur between his ears. "You still think I'm the one who needs comforting," she whispered. The dog remained there, unmoving. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Sarah continued looking at the burned remains of the house. "I know." "No," Ethan answered quietly. "You don't." She finally turned toward him. "You lost everything because of me." Walter looked down, allowing the conversation to remain between them. Ethan struggled to continue. "I've spent my entire career believing I could keep innocent people out of danger." His voice grew heavier. "This time, I failed." Sarah walked slowly across the damp grass until she stood beside him. She noticed how exhausted he looked. The wounds across his body were healing, but the deeper injuries had nothing to do with bruises or broken bones. His shoulders carried the familiar weight of a man convinced that every tragedy belonged on his conscience. Without warning, Sarah reached out and straightened the collar of his jacket, much the way a mother might quietly care for an exhausted son. "You remind me of Michael." Ethan looked surprised. He always believed every fire was his responsibility. She smiled softly. If rain ruined someone's roof, he blamed himself because he hadn't repaired it sooner. If a family lost photographs in a house fire, he carried that sadness home for weeks. She paused before continuing. "One evening, I finally asked him whether he believed he controlled the wind." Ethan managed the faintest smile. He said no. "I asked him whether he controlled lightning." Again he answered, "No." She nodded. "Then why?" I asked. "Do you insist on carrying the blame for things other people chose to do?" The question lingered between them. Ethan had no answer. Sarah looked back toward the ruins. The people who burned this house made that decision. They chose hatred. They chose fear. They chose violence. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. "You did not." The words settled inside him with unexpected force. For the first time since the ambush, someone had separated responsibility from guilt. He had spent days believing Sarah's suffering belonged to him. She refused to accept that burden on his behalf. Walter quietly approached, carrying a small metal box recovered from the edge of the burned kitchen. "We found this beneath the old stove." Sarah opened it carefully. Inside rested only a few photographs, Michael's firefighter badge, several handwritten letters tied together with blue ribbon, and a small wooden cross darkened by smoke but otherwise untouched. She smiled gently. "Then I still have everything that truly mattered." Walter shook his head in amazement. "I don't know anyone else who could say that, after losing a home." Sarah closed the lid. "A house can burn." She looked toward Ethan and Rex. "A life of kindness can't." The quiet conviction in her voice reminded Ethan of another lesson he had once learned during military training. True courage rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. More often, it appeared in ordinary people, refusing to surrender their principles after the world had given them every reason to do so. Later that afternoon, Walter drove the three of them to the small fellowship hall beside a local church several miles away. The pastor had quietly offered temporary shelter, without asking unnecessary questions. The modest brick building contained several unused guest rooms, normally reserved for traveling missionaries. They were simple but clean, furnished with narrow beds, wooden dressers, and windows overlooking a peaceful vegetable garden. Sarah placed her rescued photographs neatly upon a bedside table before sitting beside the window. For several minutes, she watched children playing basketball across the church parking lot. They don't know what happened. Walter smiled. They don't need to. No, they only need one ordinary afternoon. Ethan remained standing. His thoughts never strayed far from the memory card hidden safely inside his jacket. The evidence now existed, yet evidence meant little if there was no one trustworthy to receive it. He spoke almost to himself. I know one person. Sarah turned. Someone you trust? I trained her years ago. He walked slowly toward the window. She was one of the finest intelligence officers I ever worked with. Walter folded his arms. Still in the Navy? I believe so. Ethan's expression became thoughtful. If anyone still believes in the oath they took, he looked down at the memory card resting in his hand. It's Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Collins. Sarah listened carefully. What kind of woman is she? A faint smile appeared for the first time that day. She was never the strongest person in the room. He shook his head slightly, but she was always the most determined. When everyone else accepted easy answers, Rebecca kept asking difficult questions. She earned respect because she refused to bend facts to satisfy powerful people. Sarah recognized something in Ethan's voice. Trust. Not blind faith. Earned trust. If she's like that, Sarah said quietly, perhaps she's exactly the person we need. Ethan nodded. I only hope she hasn't become part of the same system we're trying to expose. The room fell silent again. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the sound of children laughing across the churchyard. Inside, for the first time since the nightmare had begun, hope no longer rested only upon survival. It rested upon finding someone willing to choose truth, no matter how powerful the people standing against it. The church fellowship hall grew quieter as evening settled across the countryside. Volunteers finished preparing meals for several local families before gradually returning to their own homes, leaving behind only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chirping of crickets outside. Sarah sat near the window, with Michael's firefighter badge resting gently in her hands. She often held it whenever difficult decisions lay ahead. It reminded her that courage was never measured by how often someone escaped danger, but by how faithfully they chose compassion despite it. Ethan stepped into the hallway to search for a stronger cellular signal. The memory card remained secured inside a small waterproof pouch tucked beneath his jacket. Every instinct urged him to move quickly, yet another part of him understood that haste without certainty could destroy the only evidence capable of exposing the truth. If the people responsible truly possessed influence inside local institutions, one careless phone call could reveal exactly where they were hiding. Sarah quietly joined him. You haven't made the call. I keep thinking about who might be listening. She nodded thoughtfully. Fear makes us ask whether we can trust anyone. It does. She looked through the window toward the darkening sky. But if fear becomes the only voice we listen to, the people who caused all of this have already won. Her words lingered in Ethan's thoughts. During his years in uniform, he had often told younger service members that courage and caution had to exist together. Tonight, Sarah reminded him of something equally important. Courage, without trust, eventually became isolation. He unlocked an old satellite phone that had survived the ambush inside a waterproof emergency pouch. It powered on slowly before displaying a weak but usable signal. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before entering a memorized number. The call connected after several rings. A calm female voice answered. This is Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Collins. Hearing the familiar voice transported Ethan back nearly a decade. Rebecca had been one of the youngest intelligence officers assigned to his training unit. She had never possessed the loud confidence that drew immediate attention, yet she carried an extraordinary ability to notice contradictions others overlooked. While many officers sought rapid promotions, Rebecca quietly built a reputation for accuracy, discipline, and integrity. She stood of average height with dark auburn hair usually gathered neatly behind her head, thoughtful hazel eyes that missed very little, and a composed manner that made frightened witnesses feel unexpectedly safe. Colleagues respected her because she never allowed rank or politics to outweigh evidence. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. "Ethan?" she finally asked. "It's me. I was told." Her voice stopped. "I know what you were told." She drew a slow breath. "They said your convoy disappeared." They wanted people to believe something much worse. Rebecca immediately understood. "You can't explain everything over an open line." "No." Another pause followed. "Are you alone?" Ethan asked. "I am." "Can you honestly say that?" Her answer came without offense. "Yes." Years earlier, Ethan had taught every intelligence trainee never to assume privacy, simply because no one else appeared present. Rebecca recognized the question for what it truly was, a test. "I have evidence," Ethan said quietly. "Evidence that explains why my team was attacked." Rebecca's tone changed instantly. "Are you safe?" "For the moment." "And the witness?" "Alive, I hope." She noticed the uncertainty in his voice. "You've been separated." "Yes." Rebecca remained silent while piecing together the fragments. Finally, she asked, "What do you need from me?" "I need someone who still believes the truth matters." She answered without hesitation, "It does." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since the ambush, he believed he had reached someone who had not forgotten the oath they both respected. "We'll arrange a secure meeting." Rebecca continued, "No official channels. I'll contact only one technical specialist I have trusted for years, and no one else." "Thank you." "Ethan." "Yes? Whatever happened?" Her voice remained calm. "Don't carry it alone anymore." After the call ended, Ethan stood quietly in the hallway. Sarah did not ask what had been said. She simply looked at his face and noticed something had changed. "She believed you." He nodded. "I think she did." Walter entered, carrying 3 paper cups of coffee donated by the church volunteers. "Good news?" "Hope," Ethan answered. Walter smiled. "Sometimes that's even better." The following morning, the 3 of them gathered around a folding table inside one of the meeting rooms. Ethan carefully removed the tiny memory card and placed it in the center. They had not attempted to open the files yet. Rebecca had instructed them to wait until she could examine the contents using secure forensic equipment, reducing the risk of accidentally damaging or altering the data. Sarah studied the tiny piece of plastic. "It's remarkable." "Ah." "What is?" "How something so small can frighten people powerful enough to burn down a home." Walter nodded slowly. "The truth usually doesn't weigh very much." Their quiet conversation ended when the church receptionist knocked gently on the open door. She was a cheerful woman, in her 60s, with short gray curls and kind blue eyes, behind thin reading glasses. Her name tag read Helen Morris. Having spent most of her life organizing charity drives and community meals, Helen possessed the gentle habit of treating every visitor like extended family. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said apologetically, "but 2 gentlemen came by asking whether we've seen an elderly woman matching Mrs. Johnson's description." The room became still. Helen noticed the change immediately. They said they were investigating a house fire. Sarah exchanged a glance with Ethan. Did they show identification? They flashed something very quickly. Helen frowned. "I couldn't read it." Walter's expression hardened. "What did you tell them?" "Only that many people pass through here every week." She smiled faintly. "I didn't think it was my place to discuss anyone else's business." After Helen quietly left the room, Ethan walked to the window overlooking the church parking lot. A dark sedan rolled slowly toward the highway before disappearing beyond the trees. He spoke without turning around. "They're getting closer." Sarah rose from her chair. Instead of fear, Ethan heard quiet determination in her voice. "Then we'll have to become wiser before they become faster." No one argued. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, all three of them understood the same difficult truth. The greatest danger no longer came from knowing who their enemies were. It came from realizing they could no longer be certain who their friends were. The news spread across Georgia long before the truth did. By the end of the week, television stations, online newspapers, and local radio broadcasts all carried nearly the same story. A decorated former Navy SEAL named Ethan Walker had allegedly disappeared during a classified transport mission after betraying his own unit. Anonymous sources claimed he had stolen sensitive military information, assaulted fellow personnel, and fled before authorities could arrest him. The reports were carefully written, never making accusations that could be immediately disproven. Yet every sentence quietly led the public toward the same conclusion. Ethan Walker had become a traitor. Sarah Johnson folded the newspaper without another word. She sat beside the window of the modest guest room the church had offered them, sunlight resting gently across the worn wooden floor. Outside, children rode bicycles through the church parking lot, laughing with the carefree confidence only childhood could bring. Inside, the room felt far older than its walls. "They're trying to write the ending before anyone hears the beginning," she said softly. Ethan stood near the opposite wall, staring at the folded newspaper in her hands. During his years in uniform, he had accepted criticism, impossible missions, and dangerous assignments without complaint. None of those experiences prepared him for seeing his own life rewritten by strangers who had never met him. He did not look angry. He looked tired. "There was a time," he admitted quietly, "when having my name questioned would have been the hardest thing I could imagine." Sarah looked up. "And now?" He gave a faint, almost weary smile. "Now I'm more worried about what they'll do to anyone who believes me." Rex rested at Ethan's feet. The German Shepherd's shoulder had begun healing well, though the silver streaks around his muzzle seemed more noticeable each day. His attentive amber eyes followed every movement inside the room. Even during moments of quiet conversation, his instincts remained alert, reminding everyone that danger often arrived without warning. Walter Green entered, carrying several envelopes collected from the church office. "Most of these are ordinary mail," he said, placing them on the table. "But this one came by courier." The envelope bore no official insignia. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Old Riverside Warehouse. Come only if you still trust me. Rebecca." Sarah read the message twice. "No phone call?" Ethan shook his head. "She's being careful." Walter looked toward the window before lowering his voice. "Or someone is watching her." The possibility lingered over the room. Rebecca Collins had built a career by questioning convenient answers. Ethan remembered her as the young intelligence officer who stayed behind after every briefing, not because she wished to impress anyone, but because she refused to leave until every inconsistency had been examined. While others accepted official reports at face value, Rebecca quietly searched for facts hidden beneath assumptions. If anyone inside the Navy still possessed both integrity and patience, it was her. Yet Ethan also understood the system she worked within. Good people did not always control powerful institutions. Sometimes they merely survived inside them. Sarah carefully returned the note to its envelope. "You trust her." "I do." She nodded thoughtfully. "Then tomorrow we'll find out whether your trust was well placed." The next morning arrived beneath clear blue skies, offering no hint of the uncertainty carried by the three travelers making their way toward Savannah's old industrial district. Walter insisted on driving, arguing that Ethan's injuries had not healed enough for long hours behind the wheel. Sarah sat quietly beside him, while Rex occupied the back seat, his attention shifting constantly between the passing streets and Ethan's calm but distant expression. The Riverside Warehouse had once served the city's shipping industry decades earlier. Most surrounding buildings now stood abandoned, their faded brick walls slowly surrendering to vines and salt carried inland from the nearby river. The warehouse itself remained structurally sound, despite its age. Large iron doors faced the water, while broken windows reflected morning sunlight across empty loading docks. Walter parked several hundred yards away. "No closer," Ethan said. Walter smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." They approached on foot. Rebecca Collins was already waiting beneath the warehouse awning. She had changed remarkably little over the years. At 42, she carried herself with the same composed confidence Ethan remembered from military intelligence training. Her dark auburn hair was now slightly shorter, neatly arranged above the collar of a navy business suit beneath a lightweight raincoat. Thoughtful hazel eyes carefully observed every approach before acknowledging familiar faces. She neither rushed forward nor remained distant. Instead, she greeted people with the quiet professionalism that had earned lasting respect from colleagues across several commands. When her eyes met Ethan's, relief briefly softened her expression. "You look terrible," she said. Ethan laughed quietly. "I've looked worse. I remember." Her gaze shifted toward Sarah. "You must be Mrs. Johnson." Sarah extended her hand. "I've heard kind things about you." Rebecca smiled gently. "I hope they're true. And this must be the hero I've heard so much about." She crouched slightly before Rex. The German shepherd studied her carefully, sniffing the back of her hand before accepting a gentle scratch behind one ear. "That's the highest recommendation I'll ever receive," Rebecca said. The warmth of the reunion lasted only moments before professionalism returned. "We shouldn't stay outside." Inside the warehouse, sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating floating dust above rows of unused shipping crates. Rebecca led them toward a small office, overlooking the river. Only after closing the heavy steel door did she speak again. "I've reviewed everything I could access without raising suspicion." Ethan listened silently. "Official records claim your convoy was attacked by foreign mercenaries." "They weren't." "I know." Rebecca placed a thin folder on the desk. "Every request I submitted for supporting evidence disappeared before reaching my office." Walter frowned. "Disappeared?" She nodded. "Electronic records removed. Witness statements reassigned. Chain of custody documents altered." Sarah looked steadily at Rebecca. "So someone inside the system is helping them." Rebecca met her eyes. "I no longer believe it's just one person." Silence settled across the office. The room suddenly felt much smaller. For days they had feared corruption. Now, someone serving within the Navy had quietly confirmed it. Rebecca looked toward Ethan. "Did you bring it?" Without speaking, Ethan reached inside his jacket and carefully removed the waterproof pouch containing the memory card. He placed it gently upon the desk between them. Every person in the room understood its importance. If the recording survived, it might become the first piece of evidence no fabricated report could erase. Rebecca rested her fingertips lightly on the pouch, but did not open it immediately. She looked at each of them in turn. "Once we examine what's on this card, there may be no turning back." Rebecca remained silent for several moments before opening the waterproof pouch. She handled the tiny memory card with the same precision she had demonstrated throughout her career, never rushing, never allowing anticipation to replace discipline. From another case, she removed a secure forensic reader connected to an encrypted government-issued laptop that had never been attached to public networks. She explained that if the original data still existed, they would examine a protected copy rather than risk altering the source. The room became so quiet that everyone could hear the gentle hum of the computer as it recognized the device. One file appeared, then another. Finally, a single video recording filled the screen. Rebecca looked toward Ethan. "Ready?" He answered with a slow nod. She pressed play. The first images showed ordinary preparations before the operation. Members of Ethan's team inspected equipment, confirmed communications, and exchanged routine remarks that reflected years of working together. Sarah noticed how relaxed the soldiers appeared. They smiled, joked with one another, and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of professionals who trusted both their training and each other. Watching those simple moments somehow made everything that followed feel even more heartbreaking. The recording continued. Vehicles arrived at a remote logistics compound. Civilian investigators entered carrying document cases. Voices grew more serious. The camera captured fragments of conversations discussing procurement records, unauthorized financial transfers, and missing military equipment. Although some words were difficult to hear because of wind, the overall picture became unmistakably clear. This had never been an ordinary transport assignment. Rebecca paused the recording several times, making careful notes without interrupting the flow unnecessarily. "These timestamps are authentic," she said quietly. "The encryption signatures are intact." Walter, who had remained near the window throughout the examination, slowly turned back toward the screen. "So nobody can claim this was created later?" "It would be extraordinarily difficult," Rebecca answered. "The original military authentication remains embedded in the recording." She allowed the video to continue. The atmosphere changed abruptly. An unfamiliar voice issued instructions through a radio. Moments later, another group of armed personnel entered the compound. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I remember this." Closed his eye. Closed his eye. Closed his eye. No one spoke. The recording showed confusion spreading among the teams. Orders contradicted one another. Some personnel attempted to escort civilians toward safety, while others blocked the exits. Even without understanding every military procedure, Sarah recognized uncertainty, replacing coordination. Then the camera turned. Standing near several transport vehicles was a senior naval officer wearing the insignia of flag rank. His face appeared clearly. His voice carried without distortion. "There are to be no surviving witnesses once this operation concludes." The office fell completely silent. No one moved. No one even reached for the keyboard. Walter slowly removed his glasses, rubbing them with trembling fingers before putting them back on. "My God." Rebecca replayed the statement. Then again. Each repetition sounded exactly the same. No editing, no missing frames, only a direct order delivered with chilling certainty. But. She immediately saved multiple encrypted copies onto secure storage devices before removing the original memory card and placing it back inside its protective case. "This changes everything," she said. Ethan remained seated, his eyes fixed on the dark computer screen after the recording ended. "For weeks I kept wondering whether memory had betrayed me." Rebecca looked at him gently. "It didn't." Sarah reached across the table and rested one weathered hand over Ethan's. "You were telling the truth all along." He lowered his head. "It doesn't bring my team back." "No," Sarah answered softly. "But it may finally bring them justice." Rebecca stood and walked toward the warehouse window overlooking the river. When she returned, her expression had become noticeably more serious. "We have enough to request an independent Navy investigation." Walter looked relieved. "So we're finished." Rebecca slowly shook her head. "No." The single word erased the brief sense of comfort that had entered the room. Whoever issued that order held extraordinary authority. People capable of protecting someone at that level will not simply accept this evidence without resistance. "Climb." Sarah understood immediately. "They'll try to discredit it." "They'll try to discredit all of us," Rebecca replied. She looked toward Ethan first. "They've already begun portraying you as a traitor." Then she turned to Sarah. "They'll ask why a 76-year-old widow waited before contacting authorities." Finally, she glanced at Walter. "They'll question every decision every one of us made." Walter sighed quietly. "So truth isn't enough." Rebecca answered with calm honesty. "Truth is essential." She paused. "But truth also needs witnesses willing to stand behind it." Sarah looked toward the faded photograph of Michael that she always carried inside her handbag. For many years, she had believed courage belonged to extraordinary people. Firefighters rushing into burning buildings, soldiers protecting strangers, officers risking careers for principles. Now she understood something different. Sometimes courage belonged to ordinary citizens who simply refused to remain silent. She folded her hands together. If anyone asks what I saw, Rebecca met her eyes. They will. Then I'll tell them. She spoke without hesitation. I'll tell them about the wounded dog that found my door. I'll tell them about the man I found fighting to stay alive. I'll tell them exactly what happened from the moment that dog asked me for help. Rebecca watched Sarah with quiet admiration. Most witnesses agreed to testify because they hoped someone else would carry the burden. Sarah accepted it because she believed no one else should. Rex slowly crossed the room and lay beside Sarah's chair, resting his head against her shoe. Rebecca smiled gently. I think he already knows. Sarah bent down, running her fingers through the German Shepherd's thick fur. He carried hope to my doorstep. She looked toward Ethan. Now it's our turn to carry it the rest of the way. Outside the warehouse, the afternoon sun reflected across the Savannah River as cargo ships moved steadily toward the open sea. Inside the quiet office, 4 people and 1 faithful dog had taken the first irreversible step toward exposing a conspiracy far larger than any of them had imagined. The truth had finally been recovered. Now it would have to survive, the people determined to bury it once again. Autumn arrived quietly in southern Georgia, painting the forests with warm shades of amber and gold, while the long weeks of uncertainty slowly gave way to something few of them had dared imagine. Only months earlier, justice moving at its own deliberate pace. The investigation ordered by the Navy had expanded far beyond a single incident. Independent investigators reviewed thousands of pages of procurement records, financial transactions, operational reports, and classified communications. Every new document seemed to confirm what Ethan, Sarah, and Rebecca had risked everything to reveal. The memory card recovered from the abandoned church had not stood alone. It had become the key that unlocked dozens of other hidden doors. Rebecca Collins hardly slept during those first weeks. She moved between secure military facilities, federal offices, and interview rooms, quietly assembling evidence piece by piece. Her appearance reflected the exhausting responsibility she had accepted. Her neatly tailored Navy business suit remained as immaculate as ever, yet faint shadows had begun to form beneath her thoughtful hazel eyes. She never complained. Colleagues who worked beside her often remarked that Rebecca possessed an unusual combination of patience and determination. She never raised her voice during disagreements, yet almost no one succeeded in persuading her to ignore facts once she had verified them. One afternoon, she arrived at the temporary residence where Sarah, Ethan, and Rex had been staying. She carried only a thin leather portfolio. "I have news," she said. Sarah invited her inside before pouring fresh coffee into 4 simple ceramic mugs. Rebecca waited until everyone had taken a seat. The Department of the Navy has formally established a special investigative panel. Walter, who had remained a steady friend throughout the ordeal, quietly leaned forward. So, they believed the evidence. Rebecca nodded. They believed it enough to continue looking. Ethan remained silent. Years of military service had taught him that investigations and justice were not always the same thing. Rebecca seemed to understand his hesitation. This isn't the end. No, it's only the beginning. She opened the portfolio and carefully removed several documents. The senior officer shown in the recording has been suspended, pending criminal proceedings. Sarah slowly closed her eyes. For the first time since the terrible night Rex had arrived at her front porch, she allowed herself to believe that Michael had been right all those years ago. Truth often moved slowly. But if enough honest people carried it together, eventually, it reached its destination. Several days later, Sarah received an unexpected invitation to testify before federal investigators. Although she had never entered a courtroom except to settle Michael's estate many years earlier, she accepted without hesitation. The hearing took place inside a modest federal building, rather than a dramatic courtroom. There were no television cameras, no crowded gallery, and no cheering spectators. Instead, several investigators, military attorneys, and recording officers sat quietly around a long conference table. Sarah wore the same dark blue dress she had once reserved for church on Christmas morning. She owned finer clothing years earlier, before life became difficult, but she had long ago discovered that dignity depended very little upon wardrobes. Rebecca greeted her warmly before leading her inside. "You don't have to impress anyone," Rebecca said softly. "I know. You only have to tell the truth," Sarah smiled. "That has always been easier." For nearly 2 hours, she answered every question with calm precision. She described the storm, the wounded German shepherd, the unconscious stranger in the ravine, the burned cottage, the broken tracking device hidden beneath Rex's collar. Whenever investigators asked whether she felt pressured to change her statement, Sarah answered with quiet confidence. No. Why not? She looked thoughtfully toward the window before replying. Because memory belongs to the person who lived it. The room fell silent. No one else has the right to rewrite it. Several investigators quietly exchanged glances. Her testimony contained neither anger nor exaggeration. That made it even more convincing. Meanwhile, Rex accompanied federal investigators back to the forest, where everything had begun. Months had passed since the ambush. Rain had washed away many obvious signs. Grass had begun reclaiming disturbed soil. Even so, the German shepherd paused repeatedly, as though revisiting memories invisible to everyone else. The investigators followed patiently. One forensic specialist later remarked that Rex never appeared confused. He simply moved from one place to another with calm certainty, stopping whenever familiar scents or locations awakened recognition. Eventually, the team reached the ravine, where Ethan's damaged vehicle had once rested. The wreck itself had already been removed, but modern forensic methods still revealed details hidden beneath the surface. Ballistic specialists documented impact patterns remaining on nearby trees. Soil samples preserved traces consistent with the original exchange of gunfire. Additional searches uncovered overlooked fragments of equipment buried beneath leaves and sediment during earlier storms. The evidence did not stand alone. Every discovery reinforced what the recovered recording had already suggested. Someone had attempted to erase an operation. Instead, they had unintentionally left behind a trail that honest investigators were now assembling piece by piece. When Rebecca returned that evening, she placed another folder upon the kitchen table. Her expression carried quiet satisfaction. The forensic team confirmed the ballistic evidence aligns with Ethan's account. She looked toward Rex, who rested peacefully beside Sarah's chair, and they said they would never have searched those exact locations without him. Sarah smiled gently before reaching down to stroke the aging German shepherd's head. "You carried hope to my door." She whispered the words more to herself than anyone else. "And today, you carried truth back to theirs." Outside, the setting sun spread golden light across the church gardens, where autumn leaves drifted slowly through the evening air. Inside, the modest residence, no one celebrated loudly. Each of them understood that justice rarely arrived in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it arrived quietly, one honest witness, one recovered memory, one verified piece of evidence at a time. Together, those small acts had become strong enough to ensure that the truth would never disappear again. Months passed, and the long investigation finally reached its conclusion. The evidence gathered from the tactical camera, the forensic findings recovered from the ravine, financial records uncovered through the Navy's Special Investigative Panel, and the testimony of every honest witness formed a single, unbroken chain. One by one, those responsible for manipulating military operations and concealing corruption were arrested and brought before a federal court. Their influence, once powerful enough to silence entire teams, proved powerless against carefully documented truth supported by independent investigators. Ethan attended the final hearing without wearing a uniform. He chose a simple dark suit instead. For years, the uniform had represented duty, sacrifice, and the brothers he had lost. On that day, he wanted the court to see him not as a symbol, but simply as a man asking for the truth to be acknowledged. When the presiding judge formally dismissed every accusation made against him, the courtroom remained remarkably quiet. There was no dramatic applause, no celebration. only the measured dignity that accompanies justice when it finally arrives after a long delay. Rebecca Collins sat several rows behind him. She did not smile immediately. Instead, she closed the thick case file resting on her lap and released a slow breath she seemed to have been holding for months. Later, outside the courthouse, she approached Ethan. "I suppose this is where I congratulate you." Ethan looked toward the courthouse steps. "I'm not sure congratulations fit." "No," Rebecca admitted. "Maybe not." He extended his hand. "You kept your promise." She shook it firmly. "So did you." Neither of them mentioned promotions, medals, or careers. Both understood that some victories could never restore everything that had been lost. They simply ensured that those losses would never be hidden behind lies again. Several weeks later, the small Georgia town that had once overlooked Sarah Johnson gathered for a community ceremony, unlike any it had held before. Many of the younger residents knew her only as the quiet widow who had lived in the weathered cottage near the highway. They had never heard the stories of Michael Johnson carrying children from burning homes, or Sarah quietly delivering meals to elderly neighbors during difficult winters. The investigation had changed that. Newspapers told her story. Local television stations interviewed firefighters who had served beside Michael. Former neighbors recalled acts of kindness they had nearly forgotten. The mayor stepped to the microphone. "We cannot return what Mrs. Johnson lost." He paused, looking toward the empty lot where her old cottage had once stood. "But today we can finally thank her for what she chose not to lose." Sarah accepted the community's recognition with the same quiet humility she had carried throughout her life. When asked whether there was anything she wished the town would give her in return, she smiled gently before answering, "I don't need another ceremony." She looked toward the familiar piece of land where wildflowers had already begun growing among the cleared foundation stones. "I would simply like to keep the little piece of ground where my home once stood." The request surprised many people. Some expected her to ask for financial assistance. Others imagined she might wish to move somewhere safer. Instead, she asked only to remain where so many memories already lived. The request was granted immediately. Construction began only a short time afterward. Ethan visited the property almost every day. With help from Walter Green, local volunteers, retired firefighters who had served beside Michael, and several former members of Ethan's military unit, a new home slowly rose upon the original foundation. It was not extravagant. Sarah would never have wanted that. The house was modest, welcoming, and built with sturdy craftsmanship meant to last for generations. A broad front porch overlooked the same quiet highway where one frightened German shepherd had changed so many lives. When the final board had been nailed into place, Ethan walked onto the porch carrying a small brass lantern. Sarah looked at him curiously. "What's that for?" He carefully hung the lantern beside the front door. "Because one light changed my life. And She understood immediately. Every evening afterward, the lantern glowed with a warm golden light visible from the highway. Travelers sometimes assumed it was simply a porch light, left burning by habit. Only Sarah, Ethan, Walter, Rebecca, and one faithful German shepherd truly understood its meaning. It was an invitation. If anyone ever found themselves frightened, lost, or alone, they would know one place where someone would answer the door. Rex recovered slowly over the following months. Age had begun to silver his muzzle, and the injuries from that terrible night left him walking with a slight limp whenever cold weather settled over Georgia. None of that diminished his gentle spirit. Children visiting Sarah's new home quickly discovered that the large German shepherd possessed endless patience, quietly allowing little hands to stroke his thick fur while never straying far from Ethan or Sarah. Watching him interact with retired service members inspired an idea Ethan could no longer ignore. Many military working dogs spent their final years struggling to find permanent homes. Countless veterans carried invisible burdens long after leaving active duty. Perhaps they could help one another. Within a year, the old farmland adjoining Sarah's property had been transformed into a modest support and training center dedicated to retired military working dogs and veterans, rebuilding civilian lives. There were walking trails through the pines, comfortable kennels that looked more like cottages than shelters, and quiet meeting rooms where former service members gathered over coffee without feeling the need to explain themselves. Sarah naturally became the heart of the place. No official title was ever given to her. No one needed one. Every new volunteer eventually began calling her Miss Sarah. Every young veteran eventually found themselves accepting an extra slice of homemade pie they had politely declined moments earlier. Every retired dog somehow discovered that her porch was the warmest place to spend a peaceful afternoon. One autumn evening, nearly 2 years after the night everything had begun, Ethan sat quietly beside Sarah on the front porch. Neither spoke for several minutes. The golden lantern swayed gently in the evening breeze. Cars occasionally passed along the highway before disappearing into the gathering darkness. Rex lay peacefully at Sarah's feet, his head resting comfortably upon his front paws. Though older now, his amber eyes remained watchful, occasionally lifting toward the road before settling again with quiet contentment. Sarah looked toward the lantern. "Do you think anyone notices it?" Ethan smiled. "I hope someone who needs it does." She reached down and gently rested one hand upon Rex's shoulder. If he hadn't found that little light. Her voice trailed away. Ethan finished the thought softly. None of us would be here. The evening settled into comfortable silence. The lantern continued glowing beside the front door, just as it would every night thereafter, while an aging German shepherd rested beneath its gentle light, the same light that had once guided him through darkness and, in doing so, had quietly saved the life of the man who had always believed he was the one doing the rescuing. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or extraordinary signs. Sometimes they arrive as a wounded dog refusing to give up, a widow opening her door to a stranger, or an ordinary person choosing kindness when fear would have been easier. This story reminds us that God often works through willing hearts. He places people in our path for a reason, and even the smallest act of compassion can become the beginning of someone else's miracle. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you to never ignore an opportunity to help someone in need. You may never know how deeply one act of kindness can change a life. If you believe miracles still happen through faith, courage, and love, please leave a comment with the words, "God is still working miracles." We'd love to know where you're watching from as well. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, loyalty, faith, and extraordinary dogs, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your heart during difficult times, and fill your home with peace, hope, and His unfailing love. Thank you for watching, and God bless you always.